really for the development of the industry of this region. I don't know if you hear it, but the recording of the session has been started. So officially now, your voice and your face will be recorded, as was mentioned also in the registration. So if in case you don't want to be recorded, please advise us in order that we can accommodate your request. I'd like to see if Mr. Janez Potocnik is already here with us, because I'd like to move forward with this keynote speech. He's the former EU Commissioner of the Environment, and definitely has been one of the key person in the European Commission that really push for the implementation of the circular strategies in our union. Janez, you have been interviewed by my magazine. I've always been following your work, and I'm really looking forward to your speech, and welcome to today's event.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I will start sharing my screen. I think you see it, which is great. So we have a couple of minutes more than actually, thank God. But anyway, I will go straight to the points because it's many things to actually say and to share with you. The first thing which I would like to say is that, you know, circular economy is not a new idea. It's a few decades old, also in connection to economic system, but it's more or less digitalization which made it possible in reality. And I will try to explain you that trend and also the reasons why it's so important in the presentation which will follow. So let me start directly with the question, why is resource management so important for all the SMEs, for economy, and by the way, for the sustainability which we want to achieve? Normally, when we approach to the questions of climate change, biodiversity loss, we are talking actually about the state and the impact, so about the consequences. But in a scientific approach, which we are using in the UN International Resource Panel, which I'm co-chairing, we are talking about so-called DPS-IR approach, which is D drivers, P pressures, S state, I impacts, and R response. So only talking about state and impact and about the consequences, of course, not enough. But immediately when we start talking about drivers and pressures, we start talking about humans, human activity, and our economy, and how we actually treat natural resources. It's extremely important because natural resources are kind of a bridge between economy and competitiveness, which all of you know very well. And on the other hand, the irrational use of natural resources is the major cause of the climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and health implications. So it's a common core cause root, which is basically the problem through which we can address simultaneously all the problems which we are dealing when we talk about environmental sustainability. But what actually constitutes the natural resources? Biomass, metals, fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals. We normally call all those in IRP materials. So everything extracted from Earth is actually material, including the fossil fuels. And then on the top of that, we add to that also the water and land. If we look to the trends in the last 50 years, what we can see is that the global material use, so everything extracted from the Earth, has more than tripled in the last 50 years. It has almost doubled per capita, which means that majority of that tripling can be linked to the economic development, but of course also the population growth. It's an important factor. And finally, which is extremely interesting, is that material productivity, that's the solid line which you have in the graph, and material productivity is actually a resource efficiency of the use of materials per unit of GDP. While it's actually increasing in all the countries on the global level, it was increasing till the year 2000 and then somehow started to decrease. How is that possible? It's possible because of a structural shift. A lot of things which were before produced by more resource efficient countries, like Europe, like Japan, like United States, have shifted due to known reasons, because it's cheaper to produce them, to some less resource efficient countries like Indonesia, like China, like India, which is causing that on the global level, per unit of GDP, we are actually using more materials than before the year 2000. We have also analyzed the environmental impacts in the value chain of just extraction and processing, and we found out that 90% of global land-related biodiversity loss and water stress can be connected to that. Half of the global climate change impacts and even 1/3 of the air pollution health impacts. That means that even before, if you, for example, buy your private car, and if you park it for the whole life and don't use it at all, you have already caused 1/3 of the air pollution, because the resources needs to be extracted and the car needs to be produced. If current trends would continue, global material consumption, it's according to IRP predicted to double by 2060, which means that conclusion is very straightforward and simple. If we want to increase in the future our well-being and our economic growth, the only possibility is actually that we decouple that from the natural resource use and both from environmental impacts. So that is actually very much the logic which is behind the whole science which we are producing in the International Resource Panel. Which leads me to the circular economy. Circular economy, it's actually an instrument to deliver decoupling of economic growth and everything which I was talking before, but it's also a part of a bigger picture of economic, societal, and cultural transformation, which is also needed to deliver the SDGs. By the way, digitalization, it's an instrument to deliver, to help delivering the circular economy, when the circular economy is an instrument to deliver decoupling and everything as a consequence. So there is some logical structure between them. Where do I see major problems still, or major opportunities also in the future on which we would need to focus? We have to be aware that at the end, it's about using and not owing. We don't need cars, we need mobility, we don't need light bulbs, we need light, we don't need chairs, we need to sit, we don't need refrigerators, we need chilled and healthy food, we don't need CDs, we want to listen to the music, we don't need pesticides, we need healthy plants. I will give you some examples of that later on. So dematerialization, rethinking the ownership, moving from thinking only on resource efficiency, also asking us what is sufficient. And just one example that you would understand how that it's actually important. If you are selling the light bulbs sold to the consumer are actually the basis for the producer's profit. More they are selling them, higher it's the profit. If they sell the light, suddenly light bulbs are becoming his cost, and he's incentivized that he uses less light bulbs, and via that, of course, less natural materials. So it's a very simple logic which does not harm at all consumer or producer, because at the end of the day, they can organize the profit on the basis of the services provided, and consumer has even less problems with the fact that he's not responsible and taking care for the light bulbs. The problem for the consumer normally is that our preferences are, of course, to own the products like houses, cars, refrigerators, clothes, and so on, which is to a certain extent driving consumption in a massive lock-in and underutilization. And the solution which I see is definitely in the opportunity given by the young generation, which is less ownership biased, and also by, in principle, providing alternative options, which is a great way of thinking also for the SMEs, where they have to focus and think. Another problem, if we look at it from the producer side, is that today, practically, the link between producer and the product is pretty much lost. Producer is responsible for the product until it's produced, then it's consumer. At the end of use, it's actually society. So producer has no incentive to produce a product in a way that it would last longer, that would be repairable, and so on, because retaining the value is critical. Again, rethinking the ownership is critical, and also aligning those incentives which we are sending to the producer so that we would actually need less regulation to guide us, because the market would already do an important part of the business. Why it's actually circular economy so important for the climate change? Normally, you will hear the answer from many who are dealing with the climate change: energy is the most important, which is true. But let us look behind the energy. So less than 6% is actually connected to energy production of the GHG emissions, but majority is linked to the energy use in buildings, energy use in transport, energy use in industry, energy use in agriculture, forestry, land use. So you can't manage climate change only through focusing on energy and supply side. You have to integrate that also with the thinking which is connected to the circular economy, with the demand side solutions, and of course, both needs to be integrated with so-called ecosystem services, environmental things, which are nature-based solutions, which are actually the cheapest solutions, if we are honest. So supply side, demand side, nature-based solutions are the way how we should handle climate change in the future. Which leads me to the digital. Digital is definitely, as I mentioned at the beginning, the core enabler of the transition to the circular economy. Let me give you just a few examples. The core problem of mobility is, of course, not that if we shift all combustion engine cars to the electric cars, we will solve the problem. On the contrary, the problem is really that today's privately owned European car, it's 92% parked, 1.6% it's looking for parking, 1% it's sitting in congestion, 5% we are driving it. And even when we are driving it, in a 5-seater average, it's 1.5%, which means the utility of the private owned car today in Europe, it's approximately 2%. So with sharing concepts which are enabled by the digitalization, of course, you can move really far and in the right direction. If we look to the built environment, more efficient design, planning of the infrastructure, sensors networks, according to the estimates, can save 15 to 25% of energy. And also the example which I gave you before, light bulbs and the light, what you are selling, by the way, that's already done by, for example, Philips and on the Schiphol airport. Again, it's something which is possible only through the digitalization. Or next example, the major problem in the food system, or better to say agriculture in this case, is of course the use of the pesticides and their consequences. So with the precision farming, which is known instrument, and where you use sensoring, when you use small robots, when you use also the space technology, which is again digitalization, you can go really far. But if you combine that with a real circular approach, you would actually not sell pesticides, but you would sell protection of the land against pests. So protecting 1 hectare of the land against pests costs so much, which would actually incentivize the whole companies that they would start thinking in different direction and saving pesticides instead of being incentivized to sell as much of them. Or for the food waste, connecting the demand and supply of unsold food through various kind of apps. I have here an example of Too Good To Go, or logistic and digital operator of unsold goods. Again, I have here an example of Commercio, but there are many examples which are existing. All that, it's actually digitalization as an efficient tool to address the food waste. Or energy transition. Digitalization is key for the stability and security of decarbonized electricity grids, or it's key of artificial production through artificial photosynthesis holds a promise for carbon neutral energy storage. And as you know, grids and storage are basically the core problem of energy. It's not so much a problem to produce it, but how to save it and how to transport it. Then when it comes to the consumers, traceability, transparency, visibility are core concepts of the circular economy, and they could be actually enabled by digitalization. And empowering consumers, for example, today that they can, in food and textile systems, it's pretty obvious that we can be well informed through where the food, where the textile emerges, what are the roots and so on. And this empowering of the consumer, as mentioned, it's again the core principle of the circular economy. Then if we go to virtualization, dematerialization, decoupling products and services from material use, like we have already seen in CDs. Digitalization, it's a key tool for more efficient materials handling, for cost reduction, and also for increasing sophistication of secondary raw materials, so materials production. So it's plenty of examples where digital it's really useful, which leads me to the final part, which I would like to share with you. So we all know that European Green Deal, it's a kind of quite revolutionary document, if I'm honest, because for the first time on such high level, we have basically said that economic and environmental goals are not in contradiction. On the contrary, that how we will handle the environmental future, it's actually pretty much decisive for our economic future. And it's also an integral part of European strategy to implement our international commitments, UN 2030 Agenda and Sustainable Development Goals. But with Club of Rome and Systemic, when I'm a partner, we looked to the European Green Deal. We find that the ambition and the vision are very clear, the targets are very clear, but where we have sensed that there could be an improvement if we really would like to implement them is we need to better address the drivers and pressures that cause environmental damage. We would need to offer better systemic perspective to guide decision making, and also implementation, as you know, is put at extra risk due to the COVID-19 recovery. We have put together a system, which unfortunately I do not have time to explain you in detail. I will just give you a kind of a teaser, and please look at it on our internet pages and you will find it really interesting. But as a teaser, I will just explain you how the logic works. So we have identified 10 needed redefinitions, redefining incentives, consumption, finance, governance, leadership, prosperity, natural resource use, progress, matrix, and competitiveness. Inside that, 8 economic ecosystems concretely. So the first part, it's actually on economic policies. The second part, it's on real market relations. And after that, we have actually identified also major investment opportunities. On these second 2, I will share next slide also with you so that you will at least a bit better understand what I'm talking about. But for each of those compass redefinitions, we have proposed 3 policy recommendations. So you will find in that compass 30 policy recommendations for major redefinitions and 3 to 5 specific ecosystem policy orientation. So this is about policy creation. And of course, there is also a clear explanation of why we have identified these investment opportunities. So how the economic ecosystems are actually designed? What is the logic? We looked to them through resource-intensive human needs. There are many human needs like sport, like culture, but they are not resource-intensive. And we have identified only 4: nutrition, housing, mobility, and daily functional needs, so consumer goods. So they are resource intensive and they are human needs directly. But then we have identified also 4 economic ecosystems which are resource intensive, but not directly human needs, but they are enablers of delivering those human needs, like nature-based solutions, like energy, like materials, and finally, digitalization, innovation. So all that is very closely linked and connected. And this is the simplest way how you can structure today's relations in the economy in relation to resource use, which is of course quite different from the sectors which we are using in our governments. From that, we have identified some 50 plus investment opportunities, which is probably the most useful slide for all of you who are sitting from the SME side today at this session. Of course, I don't have time to go one by one, but certainly either you can look to the original document or this presentation could be shared, which is also for me far from any problem. To conclude, science is convincing and the change to sustainable economy in society, it's simply unavoidable. Humans are supposed to be intelligent, and it's high time to prove it. So we simply have to fix a broken compass. Why is resource management so important for European competitiveness? There are two major trends which will mark the 21st century. One is decarbonization, and the second is dematerialization. You know the reasons why. Second, according to raw materials scoreboard, EU is extremely import dependent on most metals, 75 to 100%, and more than half of energy needs are met by net imports. You are seeing even today how those prices are volatile, and in the longer run, they will be increasing. They consist already today far high share of industry input costs. So how we deal with those resources being vulnerable as continent, it's extremely important for competitiveness. Resource use have high environmental impacts in the value chain, and building a clean and circular economy promises also to reduce our dependence on imported materials, lower our environmental, climate, health impacts, and create more local jobs. So it can help even improve self-sufficiency and resilience, which was exposed by COVID-19 in relation to global supply chains. So in summary, to improve European competitiveness, the focus should be on decoupling economic growth and well-being from natural resource use through redefining our economic model, linking it to the circular economy, and by applying the technological developments and digitalization. Funding opportunities are there, you know that better than me. So till 2027, you have a rare occasion of actually doubled EU budget. And it's ideal opportunity to do the transition now and not to use those funds for keeping the relations as they were and just focusing on today's profits. As Johann Wolfgang Goethe nicely said, knowing is enough, it's not enough, we must apply. Willing is not enough, we must do. We are in the phase of knowing and willing. So there are some steps still to be done. There has never been a better moment for Europe to move from the history of resource-driven imperialism into an era of responsible use of natural resources, mitigating its resource fragility and strengthening preparedness and resilience. This could also clearly position European Green Deal, give it a real historic strategic weight in our efforts to implement the SDGs. Circular economy, dear friends, it's far from a new concept. It's actually the oldest concept on the earth. Nature, it's a bioeconomy, which is organized on the principles of the circular economy. So nothing is lost. Everything has its purpose. So it makes sense to embrace it and finally start behaving accordingly. So the core question, it's actually very nicely identified in Dasgupta review, which is saying that there are two problems which are at the core of everything which is related to our economics. It is institutional failure and the failure of contemporary economics to acknowledge that we humans are embedded in and not external to nature, and to act accordingly. So for the beginning, we would need to answer only one question. Do we agree that humans are part of nature too? And if anybody would have the problem answering that question, and since I'm sitting here in Belgium, it's good to use an example of the most famous Belgian, that's Hercule Poirot. When he was asked why he's speaking about himself always in the third person, he replied something like that. If one is such a genius like me, it is very important to establish a healthy distance to himself. That's exactly what is the challenge for us and for the humanity. Establishing a healthy distance because we are the most intelligent on the planet, which leads us to the highest responsibility, not only to ourselves, not only to the future generations, but also to the others with whom we are sharing this planet. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Janez Potocnik. I'd like to be in person so we can give you a good round of applause, but I think it sounds quite creepy doing through through the videos, but thank you so much. It was a very inspiring chat. I still have though 10 minutes with you because we're supposed to go until 2:20. So I'll take the opportunity of doing my journalistic job and ask you a couple of questions. The first one is about actually the application and the doability of the circular economy. Today in Europe, there are a lot of economic resources. I've been sharing a lot of conferences like this one with many SMEs and big enterprises that are working for the circular transition. And many say today the problem is not the money, it's not the finance. We have even way too many. The problem most of the time is political mindset and regulation. Europe is moving toward that direction, but in your perspective, what still the EU can and must done to accelerate this circular transition at EU level?
Yeah, Emmanuel, I think the problem is deeper, but it's actually going to the very essence of the economic incentives which we are sending on the market. So with regulation, we do a lot, but I will just, for example, the example which I gave in my presentation about the light and light bulbs, if you would have that kind of approach, you don't need the eco-design directive. But if you don't have, if the market signals are different, you need eco-design directive. So many times, of course, business actors are complaining that we have too much of regulation. We would need much less regulation if, of course, economic signals would be different than they are. And I will, in simplified version summary, the signals, and one can easily prove them also with the data. Production, financial capital, it's overvalued and over-rewarded. Human capital is undervalued and under-rewarded, which we see in all the social tensions which we face. And unfortunately, natural capital is not valued at all. So these costs are not existing and not visible in any cost structure, which means that if these signals are sent to the market, to the producers and consumers, do you expect that from those signals we will get somehow economic, social, environmental balance? No, we will not get it. I think it's pretty much essential going to those things, but they open many questions. In particular, they open the question of social acceptability of that transition, which means, and I'm absolutely firmly convinced that any environmental transition can go only hand in hand with a social transition, with better valuing of labor and different, not only focusing on creation of the wealth, but also looking more strongly on the distribution of the wealth.
With the rise of ESG, the new financial criteria to evaluate an enterprise from a non-financial perspective, seems that there is a growing interest in companies that are actually doing good to the environment.
Yeah.
Do you think the EU taxonomy actually can be a game changer, especially if we insert proper metrics to evaluate what circular and sustainable companies are doing?
EU taxonomy can be an important part of the game changing, indeed, but as you already underlined in the question itself, depends how it is. So the devil is in the details. So the idea is good, the tool is strong and efficient, but at the end depends how essential criteria definitions in the taxonomy are actually identified.
At what stage is the debate today about metrics in circular economy?
It goes ups and down. So there are pressures from both sides, from the side of those who would like to see more ambitious approach, and there is also quite a lot of resistance on the other hand that this would be done. And there is where it is. I'm not so much involved in the Commission work directly that I would know what is the stage. I just know that it's not a simple process, and I know it's a lot of interest which are around, which just confirms also basically that this is an important and strong tool.
So before you show us a slide with 30 opportunities, can you just dig a bit into that slide? It was very interesting, but you ran really fast over it. And if you can just like give us a couple of examples, it was a very interesting slide.
Emanuele, that was actually exactly that you would look to the original document, because if I would keep it too long on the screen, we we would maybe too long focus on some of those activities, but it's not a final list. It's just a list which we have created through two optics. One was the optic of what would be the core policy direction changes which would be consistent with the transition we would like to achieve. And the second was the optic of human needs. I think that's pretty essential. You know, today we do not really focus on human needs. We focus on sectors and products. But so many times we are in overproduction and we are pretty much locked in consumerism. If you just open the TV and listen to commercials, you would have a very clear picture where we are standing. But the real question is, nobody wants actually at any way and in any place to question that the human needs to be met. I think even more, some of them are not today met due to the fact that some of the basic relations in society are not very well functioning or established even. And I think that's why it's core that we somehow start shifting the interest from certain parts of the society to the society at large. And we are all together humans with needs. And if we look at through that optic, we would somehow probably very differently manage some of our economic relations, which again, don't misunderstand me. I firmly believe this is a major opportunity for all business who are innovative, because any transition, it's always a major opportunity for those who are innovative, but those who don't see the way out, of course, resist. And that is always the case. What I've seen in Commission also, in particular, it's that unfortunately those with the problems, because they know that they have it, are louder than those with opportunities, because those with opportunities simply pick up the opportunities, while those with the problems are many times seeking for the public help. In many cases, this public help is needed and also needs to be there, but that shouldn't be just the reason to prolong some of the things which are unavoidable.
The last question, you mentioned a lot of times how to decouple products from materials. We should move faster and faster towards services. Walter Steinert was pushing this idea back in the 80s, and for this year after, we're still, trying to push that. How relevant is to educate the large public to this transition as well? Not just the businesses, but also to the people that, they are so attached to their cars, they're so attached to their ownership of things that sometimes it's hard to let it go.
It is important, but I mentioned already in presentation that there are two major opportunities. One is that the young generation is less ownership biased. That's clear. I think we can all easily agree about that. So they more look to the mobility than they look to owning a car, for example. And second, if you want an average consumer that it looks to that kind, give them option, give them the alternative, because if they don't have alternative, of course they will stick to the solutions which currently exist. And that's pretty, for me, absolutely normal. And there is one thing which I think in the context of the consumer, we have a bit unfair. While we have to empower consumers, and a lot of us are acting quite responsibly, but if we are honest, not everybody can afford that. Right. So social part, it's important, and it is in a way strange to constantly ask consumers to behave more responsibly, to buy more environmentally friendly produced and healthier food, to buy electric cars and so on. But all those things on the market are more expensive. So if the market signals go in different direction, again, it's difficult to solve those problems. It's in a way unfair from the consumer to ask him to behave with one of their interests and against their other interests. And in many cases, they can even not afford it. So I think it's very important that all those nitty-gritties of this economic structure are looked thoroughly and in a system way, so that we start putting those puzzles in the right place, that they would all work in the same direction.
And of course, digitalization can help to make these things smoother, nicer, and more accountable to adopt. So definitely, we're looking forward to see that revolution. Thank you so much to Janez Potocnik.